Hello everyone, I've just come back from a long Disney Lorcana weekend of playing myself. I've got so many thoughts on the meta, but today we're looking at the PAX online tournament, a $10,000 tournament. We're going to be looking at the top 16 decks, but before that I wanted to highlight a few decks in the top 64, which are maybe some different ink color combinations which didn't make the top 16. The top 16, there's only 4 different deck combinations, so I thought it would be good to highlight the few decks which did make the top 64, which are a little bit different to those. So the first one here is a Mufasa deck, which is rocking Amber and Ruby. Ruby and Amber obviously got quite a lot of support this set with the new damaged cards like Beast, being very good synergy with Rapunzel. Of course, there's also the new Mulan, which didn't make this one. Brawl is the only card in this one which is a non-character card for Mufasa. And what I will say about Mufasa is, of course, I've been very critical of it in the past, mainly in set 3, because Be Prepared could be countered by cards like Ursula and Bare Necessities. But now in set 4, the giant Sisu card, which is of course being played a lot in Ruby Sapphire, cannot be discarded by Ursula or Bare Necessities, which I actually think gives Mufasa quite a lot more merit in the metagame. So I'm not surprised to see Mufasa doing quite well. This one's also utilizing the new Gaston card in at 3 cost, as well as Doc, to try and ramp into these big, powerful cards. One Chernabog. Flynn Rider Frenemy, definitely a card we're going to be seeing quite a bit of in Ruby decks if you're looking to be a little bit more aggressive. Yeah, this one made the top 64, so definitely a deck to keep an eye on. I'm not so sure about this 6 cost Stitch, if I'm honest, but definitely Mufasa I think is worth experimenting with a little bit more. And I also think there's a lot of merit of playing Ruby and Amber without Mufasa, shock, and going more for a song route with cards like Ariel, maybe even Be Prepared, certainly Be King Undisputed, maybe Sleepy's Flutes to give you a little bit of a better matchup into Ruby and Sapphire. Very, very interesting ink color combination. Doesn't look like one of the best in the game, but certainly kind of that top 5, top 10 ink color combinations, and one to keep an eye on as the meta does continue to develop. Okay, up next, also making the top 64 is a different take on a Mufasa, Amber, and Ruby deck. This one does have Mulan, or at least it does have the 1 cost Mulan, but no sign of the 6 cost Shift Mulan, which I'm a little bit surprised about. I really do like the look of that card, but it is a little bit slow, and in this metagame, it does feel like you probably want to be quite aggressive with Ruby and Amber. This one does have Piglet. It does have 1-drops, unlike this other Mufasa deck, which had no 1-drops. It is not utilizing the Flynn Rider, but still does have the Gaston the Doc in there to ramp up. 2 copies of Pongo. I have to say, I prefer no Pongo. I think Pongo is not really necessary. This one also not rocking Julieta, but the second one does have a few copies of Julieta, which is of course a nice way of healing up your cards and getting some card draw. Not really sure I like the look of the Daisy Duck, as she's not really doing too much, and she's going to be a bad pull off of Mufasa. 2 copies of Brawl, 3 copies of Teeth and Ambitions. That means 5 non-character cards, so Mufasa does have a decent chance of missing. What, 1 in 12 chance, if my quick maths is correct. Only 3 copies of Maui seems a little bit crazy. Same with this one. I think you always play 4 copies of Maui personally, but of course Lady Tremaine, Madame Medusa, Perdita, all very interesting cards. I definitely am interested in trying out some more Ruby and Amber. I think that there is a very powerful color combination there. Again, I definitely think Mufasa has some legs, but I also think it's going to be interesting to see if Ariel decks with Look at This Family, maybe with Be Prepared, Be King Undisputed, could also crack the metagame. Definitely keep an eye on Ruby Amber. It's one to give some more testing to. Also making the top 64 was a Steel and Amber Songs deck utilizing Sleepy's Flute and the new Ariel card. This is the one where if you play a song, you can pay 2 to deal 3 damage to a character. Also, Ursula Eric's Bride is a very powerful card when combined with Ursula Vanessa potentially. You can play Ursula Vanessa on turn 2, which of course can contribute towards singing Zeus, but also if you did want to include any sing together songs, which this deck does not have, can be a really interesting option. Then you can shift in Ursula Eric's Bride, and it's working in a similar way to Bare Necessities. When you quest with Ursula Eric's Bride, you're able to discard a non-character card from your opponent's hand, which can hit stuff like Fishbone Quill before your opponent is able to get it down. Definitely think Amber Steel Songs is still solid, but does seem like it's going to be struggling a little bit. Sleepy's Flute probably going to be the way this deck has to go. No Tinkerbells in this one, but there is Grab Your Swords as a way of potentially removing Bucky. Not super surprised to see Amber Steel Songs struggling a little bit more, but I think it's definitely, again, a deck to keep an eye on, which is why I really wanted to highlight these other ink color combinations before we look at the more successful ones. Another deck I'm really interested in as a color combination is this Amethyst and Steel color combination. It's always been pretty solid. We of course saw in set 3 Jafar and a non-Jafar version being quite successful, and this one is going for a non-Jafar route with copies of Baboom. Only two smashes. I would personally be a lot heavier on these types of cards to be dealing with the Diablos, because I think that a real benefit of playing Steel is being able to answer Diablo efficiently. And I'm a bit surprised, therefore, to see only 2 copies of Baboom. There's also the new Peter Pan Shadow Finder, which has Rush and Evasive, and your other characters with Evasive gain Rush. So it's like the reverse of Peter Pan Shadow, which has been a really good card. Very interested to see 3 copies of I Find Him, I Flatten Him. You banish all items, and that's another thing which Steel does really well. You have the targeted removal of Babooms, but you also have cards like Benja, I Find Him, I Flatten Him to deal with items. So I'm very interested in trying out a deck like this myself, just a kind of mid-rangey deck. There's also an argument that you could try a little bit of a broom package with the 1-cost magic broom from Amethyst, the 2-cost magic broom from Steel, as well as Yen Sid, and then bouncing back Yen Sid with cards like Fox and Snake. There's not many foxes or snakes in this deck, which is also a little bit of a surprise, but the new Isabella Madrigal character in here as well, which can gain 4 lore in a single turn if it's the only quester. Really interesting deck. Again, this is definitely a deck I think has a lot more potential, and I think a lot of people have obviously been very drawn towards Bucky, drawn towards Ruby Sapphire, but I do think the meta is a lot more open than people are giving it credit for. And again, this is definitely a deck to be testing out if you're looking for something a little bit different. I think this color combination has a lot of potential and is still quite underexplored. Finally, the last deck I wanted to highlight, which made the top 64, which is a little bit different compared to some of the other decks, is a Amethyst and Emerald deck. The Amethyst Emerald deck is using Diablo, Blue Fairy, but no Bucky. So It Calls Me is just a very cheap song card, which you can just play to draw 1 card. Not usually a card that you're going to be playing that often, but of course it's just an extra song for your Diablo to potentially discard. There is 2 copies of Ursula, Deceiver of All, and also 3 copies of the Ursula, Sea Witch Queen. I actually got this card in Enchanted from my first ever Disney Lorcana draft at the weekend, which I'll probably be talking a little bit more about in a future video. But I think Amethyst and Emerald has definitely got a lot of potential. Blue Fairy is really interesting. I do also think that Bucky in other color combinations which aren't Steel is a little bit underexplored at this moment in time, and it's really great to just see again a different color combination having some decent success. So these first decks I think are the main decks really to try and explore a little bit more if you're someone that's wanting to try and break the meta a bit and not play what everyone else is playing. These are the decks to look at, because the next decks are the decks that made the top 16, and there's only 4 different ink color combinations which made the top 16. So let's have a look. Up first we have Ruby and Sapphire. We're going to look at all the Ruby Sapphire decks and kind of see the key differences. And again, having been away this weekend, I've got a lot of experience testing out a lot of these decks. I did quite a lot of scrims with my friend Jan Moyen, who's one of the best players in the game, and lots of talking with him and other players, including 2 guys from my locals who managed to top the events that were happening at UK Games Expo, which is just super exciting to have so many awesome people to talk Disney Lorcana decks with. So Ruby Sapphire, the biggest thing that really you're looking at with this deck is the uninkable count, because you're very, very heavy on uninkables. This deck's gone for 3 copies of the inkable Sisu, which is going to just help to reduce the uninkable count overall. But there's not really too many differences in these decks. The main ones you're looking at are the ratios of cards. So for example, this one only on 3 ice blocks, 3 Sisus, but has 4 Tamatoas, 3 Brawls. Another thing to definitely keep in mind while looking at these decks moving forwards is Lady Tremaine. Lady Tremaine is giving these decks a much better matchup into Sapphire Steel, because Sapphire Steel can utilize Ariel and Lucky Dime, and Ariel with Ward, the 6-cost character, has 3 strength, and she is a bit of an anti-Sisu card. I had 2 players this weekend try to ice block my Ariel to set up the Sisu, but of course with Ward and 3 strength, that's not possible. But cards like Be Prepared, cards like Lady Tremaine are a really good way of dealing with that aerial card. So I wouldn't be too surprised to see Ruby Sapphire starting to tech for that matchup a little bit more with cards like Lady Tremaine, maybe Be King Undisputed. But of course, those are more uninkables. Let's continue to look through these other Ruby Sapphire decks to see the key differences. This one has 2 copies of Vitalisphere, which honestly, I'm not a fan of. I'm just going to throw it out there straight away. It's an interesting card because obviously it's just another cheap item for Flaversham. It's another inkable card, and you can get 2 extra strength this turn if you use it. But honestly, 1 less card in hand for 2 extra strength on a single turn, I just don't think you can really afford that luxury with a Ruby Sapphire deck. I'm surprised to see it in there. It's definitely very interesting, and it is the card that kind of jumps out. The other thing is 4 copies of Be Prepared, which I also find fascinating, and to be completely fair, I quite like the approach, but there's also no ice blocks. Really, really fascinating. Going for the Vitalisphere over ice blocks, I just can't get behind that. I just don't think that sounds very good. Okay, you reduce your uninkable count, but and only 3 copies of Fishbone Quill is also interesting. Personally, I would never not play ice blocks. But if you're going down the Be Prepared route, that is definitely an argument for it, right? Just not sure Vitalisphere would be the card I would go for. Okay, it can allow you to deal with things like Queen's Castle in a single swoop. But honestly, it doesn't really seem worth it to me personally. But I like to see lots of copies of Be Prepared. I do think Be Prepared, Lady Tremaine's definitely reasonable options. But in order to fit them in, you do want to remove some uninkables elsewhere. I'm just not sure that Ice Block is the card that I would ever personally go near. All right, up next, we have another version of Ruby Sapphire. This one with 2 ice blocks. This one with 3 Be Prepareds, no Lady Tremaines, but lots of expensive cards on the top here. Very, very interesting to see. I'm trying to think really what the main differences are between this one and the previous one in terms of what cards they've cut, because they are still playing Flaversham, How Far I'll Go, Grammatala, Develop Your Brain. I have to say I like the look of this list quite a lot at first glance. I don't like the Scuttles. Scuttle, I think, is a pretty bad card, personally. Now, that's a hot take. I built this deck with Jan Moyen on the channel about a week ago now, as I'm sure many of you watched that videos. And Jan, since that, did put a couple copies of Scuttle in his version of the deck, just removing some of the uninkables. But the thing is, for Scuttle to hit 80% of the time, you need 20 items. So if you've got 20 items, you're still missing with Scuttle 20% of the time. And missing with Scuttle is so bad. You're playing a card which is really, really, really weak, and not exactly a card that this deck cares for, right? Just a card which is only questing for 1, is giving you no board presence. The benefit of it is, of course, you can sing 1 jump ahead with it. Personally, I would never play Scuttle. I mean, if we look at the amount of items, we're at 6, 10, 12. 12 items. I don't have the exact maths, but you're probably looking at Scuttle hitting around 60 to 65% of the time, which a better way of looking at that is Scuttle's going to be missing 35 to 40% of the time. I just cannot get behind that. I think there's got to be better options. It's going to miss so often, and that is going to be feeling absolutely terrible. So personally, I would never play Scuttle unless you're much closer to that kind of 20 items mark. I do think that Scuttle has potentially some use case in color combinations with Sapphire we haven't seen yet, where you go very, very heavy on the items, where you're looking at that kind of 20 plus items. There's some talk of Sapphire Steel decks not playing Whole New World. Personally unconvinced by that approach, but maybe some kind of other Sapphire color combination where you do go very heavy on items. Maybe, for example, Sapphire and Emerald. I don't know. Definitely worth exploring. I do think that Scuttle is an interesting card if you increase the amount of items. Personally, with this amount of items, it's a no from me. But again, I like to see the Be Prepared, the Sisus. Again, I would personally be more heavy on the ice blocks, but the deck looks pretty smooth to me. Scuttle is just the one card which jumps out at me as a card I would personally not play. All right, on to the next Ruby Sapphire one. This was the top 8 version. This one has 3 ice blocks, 2 Sisus that cost 3, 2 Tremaines, which I really, really like to see. Again, Tremaine going to be really good at dealing with those Sapphire Steel decks in particular. I think just a couple copies of Tremaine can really, really swing that matchup in your favor. Often they're going to have just a Tamatoa or a aerial on the board. You can't really deal with the Lucky Dime, even if you include Judy Hopps. They can just play a Tamatoa and get it back. So Lady Tremaine to shut down those greedy Sapphire Steel decks which have the very, very impressive aerials and Tamatoa, which can often gain you 16 lore in a single turn with something like a dime is really, really nice to see. Only 3 copies of Maui, 2 copies of this 3-cost Sisu, which is inkable, which I think is a pretty interesting approach. Again, so many uninkable cards you want to be playing in this deck, and it's nice to see Be Prepared making a little bit of a comeback as well. I like the look of this list, I really do. This is my favorite list in terms of the Ruby Sapphire decks I've seen so far, but we do have 3 more to look through. We have another top 8 version, this one with 4 ice blocks, also 2 scuttles. I think this is the version that Moyen shared, so it's identical to the list that Moyen and I built together, except these 2 scuttles I think have come in for 2 uninkable cards. I think the 3-cost Sisu and 1 Be Prepared. Personally, I like the deck. Again, just the scuttle for me, there's got to be something better. Maybe the 3-cost inkable Sisu. I think I would much prefer that to the scuttle. I would never go near this card personally, so I think I would play something quite similar to this. Maybe try to reduce the Medusa count, try to play some Tremaines to help the Sapphire Steel matchup, and possibly 3-cost Sisu as another inkable card, which you can shift your Sisu 8-cost onto. But I like the look of this list. All right, 2 more to look through. This was the top 4. So I think the last 2 decks both made it to the semi-finals and lost. And I'm not sure if there was a 3rd place playoff, but it is being touted as top 4 and 3rd. So anyway, these 2 both losing out in the semi-finals. This one with only 1 ice block, 1 Vitalosphere. Seeing Flynn Rider in this deck is fascinating as a way of gaining some extra lore early on. It does seem pretty difficult to actually get value off Flynn Rider, but it's definitely a card which in the late game could get you a lot of lore very, very quickly. 3 copies of Be Prepared. I'd be really interested in seeing Scrooge McDuck's mana being tried out in Ruby Sapphire with Be Prepared in particular. No Lady Tremaines, but of course Be Prepared kind of doing a similar thing. 2 copies of Belle, 1 copy of the 3-cost Sisu, 2 scuttles. This one looks a little bit lower on the curve. Only 1 ice block again. I don't love it personally, but clearly it's been very successful. Very, very interesting to see the Flynn Rider in there in particular. Again, Scuttle, for me it's a no. The maths just doesn't check out in my opinion. And the 3rd place playoff, if there was one, certainly a semi-finalist. 3 ice blocks, 4 brawls, 4 one-jumper heads. So far I like what I see. 1 Judy Hopps, which is an interesting option in the mirror matchup. The Moana is definitely a little bit weird. I did read somewhere on a Reddit post where I was kind of looking through these lists that perhaps it's not this Moana. I'll let you know in the comments if that's a mistake, but maybe some evasive Moana, and it might be a little bit of an error because this is a very random card. I think there's an evasive Moana which can maybe help you deal with the Diablos. 1 Tremaine, 3 Medusas, 2 Be Prepared. I definitely like to see the split of Be Prepared to Medusas, Sisus, and Tremaine. So your opponent is going to end up playing into something. It's very, very hard to play around all of these things. So I like this list a lot, for sure. Looks like a really nice build. The Moana, the main thing I'm unsure on, but yeah. Big shout out to all these guys on Ruby Sapphire. Congratulations on the very big tournament placements. But now we're moving on to the 3rd deck, which made the top 16, which is Sapphire Steel. And Sapphire Steel I have a lot to say about because it's the deck that I was playing myself this weekend. And it's a deck I've got a lot of belief in, and I'm going to be really interested to see how these decks have been built. The first thing that jumps out already, looking at the early curve, is they've gone for 1 jump ahead instead of Mickey Mouse, which I think is a really, really interesting idea. 1 jump ahead, I don't know if there's that many 5-cost characters I really care about that much in Sapphire Steel, but similarly there's not that many 4-cost characters I really want to be playing that early. Okay, Flaversham on turn 3 can be nice if you go Popsicle or Fortisphere on turn 1, and I can see the merit of 1 jump ahead over Mickey Mouse, for example. Because the 5-cost characters like Beast, Cogsworth, they feel a little bit lackluster in this metagame, but of course they can be really good cards to sing A Whole New World with. But instantly what jumps out is this deck is not playing A Whole New World at all, which is a really, really fascinating first deck to look at. This one is on Cruella instead of Smee. Of course, Cruella being a very nice answer for Diablo, so I can absolutely see the merit in playing Cruella. My concern would be with Cruella is that she's getting removed very easily by Diablo players. Diablo players are likely to have Strength of a Raging Fire. They're likely to have Let the Storm Rage on, so you can play your Diablo, and then you could just, if you're shifting it in, you could sing or even if you're not shifting it in, you're very likely to be able to remove the Cruella before she's actually able to deal with Diablo. So personally, I'm a little bit unconvinced by the Cruella. I think that Baboom would be a much more reasonable option. In the version that I was playing myself this weekend, I had 4 copies of Baboom, 2 copies of Fire the Cannons as my way of dealing with Diablo. And also those cards double down and help you deal with the Flynn Rider, which this deck can really struggle with in the early game. But Cruella also putting some stats on the board is also helping to counter the Flynn Rider a little bit as well. Scuttle in the mixer. This deck does have a lot more items. This one with 8, 12, 14 with 2 dimes. But again, the maths on that, you're still probably missing around 30 to 35% of the time, which is a pretty terrible hit rate. 2 copies of Benja, 1 copy of Beast Hard-Headed. I definitely like Beast, Hard-Headed, and Benja in these decks. Also 1 copy of Avalanche, which I find fascinating. That's going to be a really, really nice card of dealing with Bucky. And you can also banish locations, which this deck can otherwise struggle with quite a bit. So Avalanche, a really, really interesting card. Definitely one I like the look of. 4 copies of Grammatala, which is definitely an interesting option. With 1 jump ahead, this deck can struggle with card draw. But Grammatala without the How Far I'll Go singing capabilities, I think is less interesting to me. I think this deck maybe can afford to be quite slow in its opening though, because Aerial Tamatoa is the big finishing play for this deck. With Tamatoa and all these items, your Tamatoa can often be luring for about 9 to 10 in a single turn, which is bonkers, especially when combined with Lucky Dime. And of course the Aerial with Lucky Dime, you can just get 5 lure very, very easily. We're also seeing a lot of players use Chen Po as the bodyguard. I know Savija's been playing it. Guys, I'm going to be honest, I don't understand why. It looks pretty bad to me. It's very much within Medusa range with ice blocks, very much within Sisu range with a couple of ice blocks. I personally would not go near this card. I prefer the Cogsworth. I prefer maybe the Audrey Ramirez because of their ward capabilities. I'm not really sure there's that much you want to be protecting with a bodyguard in this deck. I mean, it could be nice to protect Aerial, but personally, I don't think the card is all that good. But I really love to see Hades in the deck. I think Hades is super interesting. Definitely that little bit of control can go a very, very long way. I was playing a couple copies of Let It Go myself, but 4 copies of Let It Go here for Tyler. So 4 Hades, 4 Let It Go gives this some really, really interesting spot removal. And of course you have the Grab Swords, the Tinkerbells, the Avalanche for that wide board removal to be dealing with those Buckies and all those other things. Very, very interesting build. Not exactly how I would build it. There's definitely a few differences, but I love the Hades. I'm not super convinced, however, by the Cruella, the Scuttle, and the Gramatalas. I can get behind a little bit more. But yeah, maybe the Chimpo, the Cruellas, and the Scuttle is definitely cards I would not personally include. But I would also have to test them myself before writing them off. All right, into the next Sapphire Steel deck. Let's see how this one is looking. 2 copies of Fire the Cannons. I think Fire the Cannons is so good in this deck. On turn 3, you can go Fishbone Quill. Let's say your opponent's already got a Diablo down. You go Fishbone Quill on turn 3, and then you can ink a card from your hand with Fishbone Quill, giving you access to Fire the Cannons instantly. That is so powerful. You can answer your opponent's Diablo without even slowing down your own ramp. 1 copy of Baboom, as well as 3 copies of Grab Your Swords to be giving you some more ways of dealing with Diablo. I would wager it's actually a little bit low for my taste though on ways of dealing with Diablo, because it's not that, you're not going to hit everything that often, right? The Grab Swords can be discarded by the Bucky players quite easily, so you're really going to be relying on them not having a way of dealing with your Grab Swords or just drawing your Baboom Fire the Cannon. So personally, I think the deck wants to be a little bit higher on these cheap removal tools. I definitely like seeing Smee in here ×4 instead of something like a Cruella. As mentioned, I think that Cruella is going to be removed very easily by Diablo players with Let the Storm Rage on and things like that. 4 copies of 1 Jump Ahead and 3 copies of Great Stone Dragon, favoring these cards over Mickey Mouse, which I think is really fascinating to see the different ramp options you have with Sapphire Steel. I would definitely always play 4 copies of Fishbone Quill. I think not playing 4 copies of Fishbone Quill is a little bit outrageous, because you can get your Aerial or your Tinkerbell down on turn number 4, which is so good into Bucky. Getting that Tinkerbell in on turn 4 is just absolutely winning you games versus Bucky. And also with the Aerial, you can apply so much pressure. Really interesting to see McDuck Manor, definitely a card I expect to make a little bit of a comeback. I think locations can be very difficult, especially for Bucky players to deal with. 3 copies copies of Beast Hardheaded, 3 copies of Beast Tragic Hero, 4 copies of Cogsworth, 4 Tamatoas, 2 Hades. I like the look of the list a lot. 2 copies of Zeus in there as well to give the deck some more spot removal. Personally, I think the deck is maybe lacking a little bit in terms of not playing the aerial 6 cost. I think this card is something which I absolutely adore and just improves your matchup into Ruby Sapphire significantly, because all of these cards are being removed very, very easily with Sisu and Ice Block. But this deck does have 3 copies of Beast Hardheaded, which is of course helping to deal with those Ice Blocks and therefore mitigate the value of Sisu. But personally, I would expect the Ruby Sapphire decks to be rocking 4 copies of Ice Blocks moving forward, and therefore I think that you might just want a few copies of Aerial, at least 2. Personally, I would play 3 or 4 to give yourself a stronger matchup into Ruby Sapphire. I like the look of the list a lot though, and we've got 2 more Sapphire Steel. Oh, that's actually all the Sapphire Steel decks to look at. So 2 very different builds, 2 decks which I would build my own version differently, but very, very cool to see. That is for sure. And Sapphire Steel is a deck we've done a lot of testing with over the weekend, playing it against Ruby Sapphire in particular, and the Lucky Dime Tamatoa, the Aerial, are so good in that matchup, and it makes things really, really difficult for Ruby Sapphire if they're not playing Tremaines and Be Prepared especially. So very, very interesting. Personally, again, I would be heavier on the Babooms. I would also be heavier on the Aerials. Apart from that, I like the look of it a lot, and it's going to be really interesting to see maybe one jump ahead Grammar Tala being a better approach than Mickey Mouse, for example. Definitely something I'm going to be testing out quite a bit. I also want to give a mention. My friend Lenny, who won the tournament on Sunday in the UK, is a big fan of the 4-cost Aurora in this deck, which protects your items. They can't be removed by your opponent, and you can exert your items every turn. For every item, you get a Develop Your Brain, essentially, almost, because you look at the top 2 cards of your deck, you put 1 on the top, 1 on the bottom. So if you have 4 items and Aurora on the board, every turn you can exert your Popsicle, and you can look at the top 2 cards, put 1 on the top, 1 on the bottom, and then do it again and do it again. So if there's a card you really, really need, you can just search the top 4 cards, 8 cards or so of your deck. I guess 4 cards, because you're putting 1 on the top, 1 on the bottom. So then the second Popsicle you exert, you would still see, you'd only see 3 cards into the deck essentially. So definitely an interesting card though, with the 1 jump ahead being a way of ramping and getting that card down early. And of course, also worth mentioning How Far I'll Go if you're playing these 4-cost characters nice and early as another ramp option to add cards to hand. I think Sapphire Steel is a great deck. I think it's got very, very good matchups into both Bucky Discard as well as Ruby Sapphire, and therefore I think it's going to be a deck which we're seeing a lot more of as the meta settles. I'm a huge fan of this deck. Up next, let's look at the Emerald Steel decks. Emerald Steel was the deck which was victorious this weekend, which a lot of you are not going to be surprised to hear, but I do think it's not as good as people think. I think that a lot of decks are able to deal with this, Sapphire Steel in particular. I think that lots of decks have strong matchups into this. It is very much warping the meta, with of course Diablo being almost an answer the card or lose type card. So you're definitely going to see a lot of steel decks with cards like Baboom and Fire the Cannons as ways of dealing with this. Cards like Tinkerbell, Avalanche to remove Bucky are really, really important as well. But this list, Grab Your Swords, definitely in there for the mirror matchups to help you out a lot. Definitely like to see Ursula, Deceiver of All with all those songs, 4 Sudden Chills, 4 Storm Rage On, 4 Strength. And I also like to see all of the shift, big shift options with Pegasus, Robin Hood, and Diablo in there as well. I think the main thing that's missing from this one, which I think some players might be interested in experimenting with, is Prince John. Prince John with Sudden Chill could help you out in the mirror an awful lot. And yeah, overall, deck looks solid. And next we have a very different version, very spicy version of Emerald Steel. This one was also in the top 16 by Andrew here, with 4 copies of Strike a Good Match and 4 copies of Flynn Rider, his own biggest fan, of course, an uninkable card. Only 1 copy of Diablo as the 1-drop, so no Pegasus and no Robin Hood. So this one's cut the Robin Hoods entirely, which honestly, I kind of like the idea. Morph in there with Tinkerbell, which is going to be great in the mirrors. Under the Sea as a very, very spicy inclusion as well. Of course, you can sing this with Ursula, but that's not really doing much. Very, very spicy list. A little bit slower, a little bit more greedy. Strike a good match, just going to be a nice backup option to be singing with Ursula to discard cards like Under the Sea, discard cards like Flynn Rider, but also a good card to be discarding potentially with Diablo to get that shift through nice and early. Fascinating list here from Andrew. Really good to see the Ursula Deceiver, the Strength of a Raging Fire, Storm Rage on all being played ×4, because I think that is what the deck wants still. You're overloading your opponent's removal. If they remove your Diablo, they might not be able to remove your Ursula. This one is also in the top 8. Well, this one's in the top 8 and is also very, very spicy with Hidden Cove, which 3 copies of this location over something like Pegasus is fascinating. Chosen characters get +1 strength and +1 willpower while here. So suddenly, if you move your Bucky into Hidden Cove, it's not being removed by Tinkerbell or Avalanche. So that is really, really interesting. Also, your Diablo into Hidden Cove is suddenly not being removed by Babooms and Fire the Cannons, but suddenly requiring 3 strength, 3 damage removal. Absolutely insane idea with the Hidden Cove. Not something I expected to see, but I can certainly see the merit. This one also 2 copies of Smash, as well as 2 copies of And Then Along Came Zeus. And Pegasus is the card which has been dropped here, keeping Robin Hood in the deck instead. All right, and this was the tournament winning deck, also utilizing Hidden Cove. That is incredibly spicy. Again, Hidden Cove giving your Diablo and potentially Bucky some more protection. I can absolutely see how that would be disgusting to deal with for many, many decks. Only 3 copies of Bruno. This one does have the Pegasus, though, as well as the Robin Hood. So a whole bunch of 1-drops in this one, totaling 14 1-cost cards. As a result, not playing the Ursula package at all, but does still utilize Let the Storm Rage On and Strength of a Raging Fire. So bidding off the Ursula Deceiver of All to fit in a few more cards that we don't often see. 2 copies of Grab Your Sword, 3 copies of Tinkerbell. Congratulations to Jordan on the win. But finally, the last deck which made the top 16, and is a deck which I was very impressed with myself this weekend. It caused me some real problems as a Sapphire Steel player, is Ruby and Amethyst. Now, Ruby Amethyst has always been a deck which has continued to perform well even when the odds have been stacked against it, and there's definitely some different ways to go about building this one. What I love to see already here from Muxter in the top 16 is Chernobog's Followers and Magic Broom. Chernobog's Followers is a card I've always loved. Just being able to gain 1 ink and draw a card is great, but in a Bucky meta that's even more powerful because you can have it down on the board, and then once Bucky has emptied your hand, you can then draw with the Chernobog's Followers, and suddenly you've got something to play which can't be discarded by Bucky. And Magic Broom is doing a very similar thing. Kuzco for a bit more card draw, Pegasus as a way of hoping to deal with Diablo. I think it's a little bit optimistic. Again, Diablo's just going to be able to remove your Pegasus very, very easily with cards like Let the Storm Rage On and Strength of a Raging Fire. So I'm not convinced Pegasus is actually doing too much. And personally, I don't think it's the way to go. Similarly, for the same reasons as Corella. 4 copies of Brawl, which I definitely can get behind. 4 copies of the new Sisu, the inkable one. 1 Spellbook, which is going to be very good against those decks, such as Ruby Sapphire, Ruby Sapphire, which have very little item removal. Also, a lot of the Emerald Steel decks are struggling to deal with Sorcerer Spellbook. 4 copies of Queen's Castle, which is still really the money card in this one. Just 2 Be Prepared, but 2 Tremaines and 2 Medusas. Fascinating deck. No Flynn Riders, but I do, and no Bee King Undisputed. But I really do think Ruby Amethyst has got a real chance in this meta. I think it's going to struggle most against Bucky, I would wager. I think you're going to really, really be struggling if they play Bucky on turn 2. But the Chernobog's Followers, the Magic Brooms, cards like Tremaine can maybe give you a little bit of a fighting chance against Bucky. You're certainly going to have to remove those Diablos as soon as they hit the board. So heavy on the Brawl makes a lot of sense. All right, up next, maybe Teeth and Ambitions could enter the deck as well as another way of dealing with Diablo, possibly. But I'm not really sure that's doing too much overall. Okay, up next we have another Ruby Amethyst, this one by Michelle. This one does have Flynn Riders. It does not have the Magic Brooms, but is rocking Pascal and Chernobog's Followers. Pegasus ×2. We have Brawl. We have the Bounce package, the 3-cost Sisu, and then only 3 copies of Maui, 3 Be Prepared, but also 2 copies of the new Sisu card. I like the look of this list quite a lot. Flynn Rider, definitely a really, really fascinating card, and I do think can be a problem for a lot of decks to deal with. One problem with Flynn Rider is he's kind of suffering for Diablo sins, because a lot of decks are going to have that 2 strength removal, and therefore Flynn Rider is going to be getting removed by a lot of decks. But if you do play against decks which are not playing much removal in the early game, Flynn Rider is going to be an absolute menace for Sapphire Steel to deal with if they don't have that Baboon, if they don't have that Fire the Cannons. Flynn Rider is going to be gaining 6 to 8 lore before your opponent even knows what hit them, and that can make all the difference with these goats. So personally, I do think Flynn Rider might be the key to success for Ruby and Amethyst. And finally, the deck which actually came second, so very, very close to taking the win. And this is the list I like the look of the most. Chernobog's followers, Minnie Mouse and Olaf. I think that Pascal and Magic Broom are definitely cards to take a look at, because I think the Magic Broom, again, going to really help the deck into Bucky. So personally, the Minnie Mouse and the Olafs are the main 2 cards which I don't like the look of, but everything else I really, really like the look of. I want to mention Bee King Undisputed as a card which I think is going to be a real meta powerhouse. I was fortunate enough to meet Emily Abadira this weekend. I actually played some draft against her. She beat me, and Bee King Undisputed is a card of hers which I just think is going to be really, really good in this meta. It's going to cause the Sapphire Steel players a lot of problem, being greedy with Tamatoa and Aerial. It can be very good at dealing with all sorts, and also combined with the Queen's Castle can give you a lot of board control and ways of just continuing to rack up lore and have card draw. Also 2 copies of Dolores, which is an amazing card. When you play this character, if your opponent has an exerted character in play, you may draw a card and it quests for 2. This card is very, very similar to the 3 cost Maleficent from set 1, which draws a card, but she has better stats and moreover quests for 2. I've always felt the Maleficent character to be a little bit slow, but Dolores does a similar thing, but quests for more. So I really like the look of this build with 2 copies of Be Prepared, no Tremaines, but Bee King Undisputed. Being able to be sung by Merlin Rabbit and Merlin Goat, I think is absolutely incredible. And I really do think that Ruby Amethyst being good in this meta game is super important for the meta, because otherwise you would kind of just have the rock, paper, scissors meta in some ways of the Bucky discard, the Sapphire Ruby control, and the Sapphire Steel deck as well. But Ruby Amethyst going to be more popular as the meta settles. I think the best list is still to be settled on. I think Bee King Undisputed is the way to go with these decks. Singing it with Goat and Rabbit just sounds so damn spicy, and I really do think that these are decks to keep an eye on. And if Ruby Amethyst enters the meta in a big way, I also think that opens up the potential for a lot of these other decks which we looked at the start. Things like Mufasa, maybe even Ruby Amethyst songs, things like Sapphire Steel, maybe some Amethyst Steel and Amethyst Emerald as well. I do think there's still a lot of room for experimentation, but clearly Bucky, Ruby Amethyst, Sapphire Steel, and Sapphire Ruby are the top 4 decks at the moment. But it's great we've got a 4-deck meta, and I do think as the meta settles, that meta is just going to continue to grow. It's definitely not looking just as Bucky dominated as people were first worried about. And I think it's a really interesting metagame, and one that's very different from the set 3 metagame, which I also think is quite exciting. So there's definitely going to be a lot more meta report videos coming in the next few days. I am going to be posting my own meta report with my own versions of each deck, probably tomorrow, but maybe the day after, as I get ready to start recording some physical Disney Lorcana content with a bunch of guys from my locals who again won the two of the tournaments this weekend in the UK. So really excited to be bringing you a very different style of content soon. Big shout out to all the players for these decks. Shout out to the tournament organizers at the pack as well. Hope everyone had fun, and hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you watched this far, give it a like and subscribe for more. See you all very soon for more Disney Lorcana Set 4 meta content.